These people were tortured, killed, and brutally scattered. 2 years later, they forcibly acquired the land, left it in ruins, and burned it to the ground. They did the same with almost half of the Polish professors and their family members in Lviv in 1941. They drowned Ukrainians in the motor oil. But how was it really? That's what we're about to find out. Sit more comfortably, dear ones, as it's scary. The horrors of Nazi Germany during World War II knew no bounds. The occupying regime destroyed anyone who could pose a threat to its spread and establishment of new orders. At the very start of the war, Reich Chancellor Adolf Hitler clearly designated the role of Poland and specifically its intelligentsia. People from this environment were planned to be destroyed, or at least their number was planned to be reduced to a minimum. In August 1939, in a narrow circle of confidants, Hitler said that everyone who we can identify as representatives of the upper classes in Poland must be liquidated without fail. If someone takes their place, they need to be brought to justice and given advice at the right time. Such of so-called upper classes the Nazis really summoned, and indeed a lot of people. Officers, individuals in the Polish government, judges, large landowners, businessmen, intellectuals, and priests. In essence, anyone who could become a real leader and rally masses behind them. All representatives of the Polish intelligentsia need to be annihilated. Sounds harsh, doesn't it? But such is already the law of life. Indeed, the enforcement of this so-called law, decreed by the dictator, was taken up by the SS representatives, starting in the territory of Poland itself. In spring 1939, 180 professors and employees of Krakow's universities were sent to Nazi concentration camps. Approximately a year later, one of the Nazi leaders, Hans Frank, who became the general governor in Krakow after the war began, declared in a speech before the SS representatives, "It's impossible to describe how much trouble we had with the Krakow professors. If we had finished the job on site, everything would have looked different. That's why I am decisively asking you not to hide anyone in concentration camps in the Reich, but to carry out liquidation on the spot. Any other way of solving this problem is burdensome for the Reich." The fact that the arrests of Polish intellectuals has become a matter of grave concern, very resonant not only in Poland, but throughout the world. Moreover, due to international publicity, the Nazis were even compelled to release from concentration camps a significant majority of Polish intellectuals, including those already condemned Krakow intellectuals. Thus, when in June 1941 the Germans entered Lviv, they used different methods. No longer was there a question of deporting Polish professors, who at that time lived and worked in Lviv. Repressions were carried out directly in the city in Lviv. Case closed. A special assignment arrived from Krakow to Lviv, aimed at liquidating Lviv's professors of Polish descent. It was a covert operation, like the one carried out in Krakow on November 6, 1939. Yet another attack on Polish culture and science. The tasks were executed differently in Lviv than they were in Krakow. This time people were liquidated on the spot, says Kamila Jasinskaya, a researcher on the topic of persecuted Polish professors. This is the task of the so-called special assignments, about which the researcher wonders. Essentially, 230 members of the Einsatzgruppen from Warsaw, Lublin, and Krakow, who came to Lviv with prepared lists of those needed to be eliminated. On July 2, 1941, 3 Gestapo officers arrived for the professor of geometry and former rector of Lviv Polytechnic, Kazimierz Bartel, at his villa. The professor was not home when they arrived. The Germans forced his daughter and girlfriend out into the street. After that, they destroyed part of the scientific books from his personal library, burned some, and sent others to Berlin. The same villa was occupied by high-ranking German officers, and Bartel was sent directly to his place of work, to the Lviv Polytechnic. The professor had to be taken alive, as he had unique strategic significance for the Germans, for the Nazis. But about the fate of this man will be known much later. That same day, Einsatzgruppe arrested another 27 scientists, mostly doctors and lawyers. They did not spare their families, nor the people who just happened to be nearby at the time of the arrest. The Germans worked in 2 groups. The first dealt directly with the arrests, while the second was busy looting property. Those arrested were promptly transported to Bursa Abrahamovich's building, which housed a school and an internment camp. Professor and pediatrician named Franciszek Josef Stefan Grohr, who was detained with the others, described what happened during those hours. The car arrived at Abrahamovich's institution gate. He led the convoy. We were brutally pushed down the long corridor, where many of our colleagues were already leaning against the wall. They forced us to stand still in their charge. We were punished with blows or bats to the head for the slightest movement. We remained facing the wall until the second hour of the night as they continued to bring in more people. For hours, gunshots and screams were heard from behind the wall. Then a guard spoke. Again, there was one less of us, but I guess he spoke that way just to instill more fear in us. All the condemned were summoned, but it was just a formality, just to mock them once more. People were asked brief questions, responses to which, in principle, they could not influence. After these interrogations, the Gestapo released the arrested personnel who worked in the buildings of some scientists and one professor, the same pediatrician named Franciszek Grohr, whom I quoted earlier. I presume that he managed to escape due to a connection with the Englishwoman, and he himself had a German-like appearance. Later, Grohr shared a few more details about what had happened. For example, beyond them being targeted and beaten, their properties were stained with the blood of their own people. But that's not the worst of it. There was more to come. It is important to understand the state people were in who had to go through all these trials. As a human being who had been diagnosed with a depressive disorder, I can't even begin to imagine what I would be like after undergoing cancer treatment, exhaustion, and full-scale rehabilitation. To say that all of this has become, so to speak, my normalcy, as if I had not turned to a psychotherapist in time. Really. At that moment, Grohr was in the yard of an improvised prison, aimlessly wandering around. It was already light outside. It could be around 4 a.m. when they brought out a group of people through the back door of the building. 15-20 people were there. Some I recognized and some I didn't. A chill ran through me. They had changed so much. On the gallows, freshly dug graves and Gestapo executioners were already waiting. Everyone was ready. They led to the pits about 4 persons, and only 20 minutes after the scene that Grohr had witnessed, the first shots rang out. One of the few witnesses of what happened turned out to be the police technician Tadeusz Gumowski. He and his family watched everything that happened from the window of their apartment. People were brought from the side of Abrahamovich's building and thrown over the edge of pits right towards us. Executioners stood on the other side of the pits. After the salvos, nearly all victims fell into the grave. We were given a ladle. As much as they had, there was almost up to 5. After the shooting, the soldiers quickly covered the grave with earth. Crimea is killing me. My brother, friends, and sister were all executed. No one of those ordered after the execution was satisfied with shooting from a revolver, so it seemed very likely that some of them were stuffed with live ones. The fact of the professor's murders was documented in his diary by SS officer Felix Landau. From his notes, it seems that on the first night, the Nazis shot 32 people. And within just a few days, they shot again. The execution was repeated. The last victim perished on July 26th within the frame of the planned operation. He was the first one they held hostage. Mathematician Kazimierz Bartel. He was so rich that before becoming a professor at the Polytechnic, he managed to bribe the prime minister of the Polish government. Due to a number of events, Himmler, the head of the SS, met with Bartel before his departure. Apparently, Bartel was offered to puppeteer the Polish office. His refusal cost him his life. In July, Special Assignments Department killed 40 people from 18 to 74 years old in Lviv. Among them were 27 professors with world-renowned names. Philologist Tadeusz Wojciechowski, medic Antoni Ciaszyński, Polish mathematician, one of the representatives of the Lviv Mathematical School, Volodymyr Stojic, and others. Not all of them were Poles. Among the executed, there was also a Ukrainian. Adam Solovey was a professor who was considered the best obstetrician gynecologist in Lviv in the 30-40s of the 20th century. The man studied in Poland and worked across the border for a long time. But as soon as the medical faculty was reopened in Lviv, he immediately returned to his native region, where he worked until the Nazis came to kill him. The SS Führer Otto Rasch and Karl Ebengard Schengard commanded the criminal operation. It's shocking that the rogues who degraded the degrees of doctors and scholars of their time lectured at German universities. And in Lviv, these Nazi gentlemen practically shot their colleagues. The deaths were not communicated to anyone, leaving friends and relatives struggling to locate their loved ones. Eventually, in the German law enforcement bodies, they themselves replied, claiming they knew nothing. In the following month after the massacre in August 1941, the army of the Ukrainian nationalists was again subordinate to the forces of rebellion in Poland. Besides, the Gestapo arrested the professors. Indeed, at that time, only two names were known: Bartel and the Polish writer and pedagogue Stanislaw Pilat. Apparently, the Polish side, represented by the Emigration Office based in London, only became aware of everything closer to the middle of 1942. And the story did not end there. In 1943, a new punishment was introduced: the destruction of mass graves. Leave no traces. Then, using the prisoners from Janowska concentration camp, they created the death squads, which were to dig up all mass graves in Lviv, exhume and cremate the remains. The same happened to the Polish professors. On November 8, 1943, they exhumed a grave in which the bodies had been dumped, pulled them out, and loaded them into vans. The remains were taken out of town into the forest. They added them to over 2,000 other exhumed bodies from other graves and incinerated them. It burned for 3 days. Afterwards, they sifted ashes to find gold crowns, rings, and possibly other valuable items. The remnants were put through a concrete mixer that turned them into dust. Nothing was left of those people. I'm not talking about the slaughtered professors. Even though at first sight it might not seem mysterious, in the years that followed it gave rise to a massive manipulation, assumptions, and false accusations. It is a shame that the whole process of choosing who to execute took place. I suspect most of those killed were reputed scholars, lawyers, and doctors with private practices who contributed to scientific papers. And this meant these people had money. Also, by one account, the mundane desire to rob and loot was a cause for the murders. For instance, John Grech, a 66-year-old professor of medicine, was a notable collector at the time, and after his execution, the Nazis took all his possessions. Moreover, Peter Menton, a collaborator and translator for the Nazi service, who was also an avid collector, figured prominently in the affair of the Polish professor's murders. In 1977, an international scandal erupted when paintings belonging to the murdered Lviv professors were found in his possession, despite the man himself claiming that he arrived in Lviv later and was only interested in saving the paintings. There is also another version. According to it, he drove the scientists from Moscow to Stalin. They tried to spread this story among the population as much as possible so that everyone would think that they were executing Soviet policies in a Polish-like manner, and also those who actively cooperated with the Bolsheviks. The fact of cooperation with the Soviet authorities is confirmed by researcher Andriy Bolyanovsky in his book, The Murder of Polish Scholars in Lviv, in July 1941. Quote, "Facts, myths, investigations." And he insists that, I quote, "they cannot be blamed for this because at that time these people simply had no choice." One of the main reasons for the Polish scientists' shock, in his opinion, is that the Nazis wanted to exterminate some while others were afraid. Meanwhile, Soviet propaganda began to spread the myth, as if the actual lists helped Ukrainians compile, and even as if Ukrainians showed the Nazis where the representatives of the intelligence lived. Indeed, these are just empty words from Moscow. No substantiated evidence supports it. Here's what historian Andriy Bolyanovsky says about the formation of the lists. In the proceedings of the prosecutor of the district court in Bonn in 1960, it is clearly recorded that all these lists were compiled with careful study of the publications in the Soviet press, which was published in Galician at that time. Obviously, it reached occupied Poland as well. In addition to that, the Nazis could compile the lists on their own, relying solely on the telephone directory. The fact that the list included people who died before the Nazi occupation of Galicia attests to this. Understanding the circumstances as they really were, it's complicated by the fact that no actual document or written order has been found where it would state about the arrest and execution of professors directly in the text. The blame for the death of Polish scholars in Lviv was put even more on Ukrainians after the departure of the Nazis. There were several reasons for this. Two main ones. The first step was to depict Ukrainian nationalists as villains, a familiar tactic. This matter is alive and present today. Secondly, to create a myth that could thwart the convergence of Ukrainian and Polish political migration. And ingraining people with scientific global names is an ideal scenario for it. Also, undoubtedly, a contributing factor to the history that the execution lists helped Ukrainians organize. Yet another storyline emerged that Ukrainians themselves were executing Polish audits. Either Nightingale Battalion or Ukrainian Sikh immediately executed the actions. This battalion was subordinate to the Organization of Ukrainian Nationalists and was mostly made up of Ukrainians. According to the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti legend, in this way, through the execution of professors, Ukrainian nationalists almost avenged the Poles for attempting the life of Yaroslav Stetsko, who was the head of the Ukrainian state formed by the Banderites. But this is nothing more than one of the myths created by the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti. Stetsko was actually shot at, but this occurred several days after the assassination of the first group of Polish Intelligentsia. In its legends, the committee blamed the 15-year-old Lviv resident Janina Jacek-Wilczura. The survivor called the organizers of the murders poulterers because he saw the depiction of birds on the machines of the killers. The propagandists didn't have to think long. Birds on cars, eagle heads, okay, this definitely signifies Nightingale. The battalion was commanded by Yevgen Pobivushi, a volunteer of the Ukrainian Galician Army, a colonel of the Galachina Division, and Roman Shukovich, an active organization of Ukrainian nationalist member. However, Wilczura's words seem dubious, as there is no confirmation for them in any sources. The Security Service of Ukraine has collected many volumes of cases related to Solovki subdivision, none of which contain data about Ukrainians participating in the execution of Poles. According to the researcher Bolanovsky, one of the authors of this myth was the then head of one of the departments of the State Security Committee at the Council of Ministers of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, Fedor Sherbak. On his orders, in the fall of 1959, the collection of incriminating evidence against the Nachtigal Battalion began. The directive letters contained direct instructions to prepare evidence. This meant teaching people what and how they needed to speak. In this way, they inadvertently found those who saw everything with their own eyes. Rustling leaves bear the sound of joy. When gathering evidence, it is necessary to use the published articles about Nachtigal crimes. One of the witnesses was Gabriel Sokolnitsky, a former Polytechnic rector. He was familiar with many from the arrest list. At that moment, Lviv was 82 years old, and he was expected to blame Ukrainians for the crimes that led to his release to a sanatorium in Berlin and to his children in Poland. Also, the Komitet Gosudarstvenoi Bezopasnosti's version flatly rejects any criticism. All responsibility for the crime lies with the SS officers, from those who imposed the punishment to those who carried it out. The reason for the obstinate persistence of the legend about the complicity of the Nachtigal Battalion in the killing of the Polish scholars was to prevent impartial Ukrainians from setting up their own commissions to investigate the crimes of the Nazi occupiers. Commissions were indeed established by the Russians in the Soviet Union, Jews, and Poles. Prominent political figures representatives of these nationalities considered Ukrainian nationalism as one of their main enemies. The myth about Ukrainians' inclination towards these excesses was used by political forces uninterested in Ukraine's closeness to Poland. And even when some names became known, nobody was fully punished for these crimes. The organizers, instigators, perpetrators, and those involved in this murder were terrified or imprisoned. But not for this crime, but for others. And the murder of the Polish professors in Lviv went down in history as one of many unpunished crimes. At the scene of the tragedy in Lviv, which is now called the Student Park, a symbolic monument was erected in 2011. It has a stone with the number 5, which means one of the commandments, do not kill. The monument is slightly distorted. This symbolizes that the commandments were not fulfilled. A view from the memorial on the hill shows a cross and a plaque with names of the executed professors. Kind folks, if you've watched this video to this very second, know that you're the best. I'm so grateful and happy you're still here with me. It's really awesome. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel, share this video and sponsor from 10 hryvnias a month, becoming a part of this channel to watch unique content that will not be released anywhere else. You were with Sonia. See you in the next video. And for now, share this or this. They're also cool, right?